This video is brought to you by 80,000 Hours. Hi there. So as I mentioned last week, your girl is currently very art blocked, and it is because I need to study the fundamentals. I haven't done it in a while. I look at the work that I do and I'm like, yeah, we're rusty and I should probably refocus on doing some of that stuff. And as a busy little artist girl, what better a place to do that than in a monetized YouTube video? So for those of you out there wondering, like, wait, you know how to draw, why are you like learning how to draw again? Well, I at least personally find with my own work, whenever I get in a little bit of an art funk, whenever I can feel my art style is evolving or the things that I want to focus on depicting in my work are skewing in a certain direction, usually the best course of action is to try to go back and study, get, you know, more references in my visual library, focus on actually improving my fundamentals in my craft so that I can actually do more from imagination and make the kind of art that's in my head trying to come out that I can't quite visualize. So this week, I want to particularly focus on background painting, background design, because it is one of the areas in my artwork that I definitely ignore because I do mostly like character design and character work. And it's also something that has so much strong potential for storytelling, which is something that's increasingly becoming a priority in my art. So this week, I am going to paint backgrounds and environments and references until I get a little bit better at them, hopefully. So here's how this video is gonna go. I'm going to begin by finding a few photos to do painting studies of so I can get a little bit more comfortable painting and stylizing different reference scenes. I am then going to figure out some weak areas in my studies and identify some of the painting skills I want to improve on. And then finally, I'm going to come up with a few original compositions and environments to paint from memory to try to improve my studies and use what I've learned without reference. The goal of this video isn't really to dramatically improve my backgrounds in a week, that's a little ridiculous, but mostly to figure out what I need to improve on and get me comfortable enough painting backgrounds and motivated enough to actually do something about it. So let's start this little experiment by going on the Pinterest and finding a couple of little background references for me to paint and do studies of. Hold on. This is how you know I'm serious. So already I'm like really revealing myself on Pinterest here because half of this is just going to be Better Call Saul Breaking Bad because I'm going through something. Don't mind me. Just don't mind me. I don't want to talk about it. So let me go to one of my folders. Here's something. What did I tell you? I was hoping that I had painting references for backgrounds and environments in here. See, now this is some of the stuff that I hope to utilize whenever I'm painting these backgrounds, methods for simplifying things, guides for composition and creating depth. One of the things that I find myself really struggling with right now, surprisingly enough, because I've worked on it a lot actually, is values and creating depth in my pieces and choosing good colors to simulate that depth. I don't know if I just have, you know, iPad baby brain or something, but I really do have a nasty little habit of making all of my colors way too saturated and almost at the same level whenever I'm doing these kinds of environment paintings and studies, because I'm also challenging myself not to really color pick in these and, you know, only color pick as reference and actually train my eyes to see the colors that are there. That's a goal that I want to improve on. Composition in general is a huge thing. Using color in composition and different visual hierarchy and visual elements to guide the eye of the viewer in a piece. I am going to go and choose an arsenal of reference images to paint that will give me some kind of progression towards the things that I want to work on, and then I will check in with you.
2 days later.
Since I have done a couple of different forest studies in the past few weeks, I wanted to choose a decent variety of things to study here just to dip my toe into a few different scenes. So for my first few paintings, I want to do a study of this little waterfall, this mountain scene, this city street, and finally this castle, which will almost certainly be the death of me. I feel like all of these will give me a good balance of subject matter and help me figure out how to paint some of the elements in my environments later on. On that note, it's extremely frustrating whenever I'm looking for real photos to use as drawing references or real art to learn techniques from, and I can't find what I'm looking for because a surplus of artificial imagery is drowning out human artists. As artists, the use of AI-generated imagery replacing our work and negatively impacting our livelihoods is obviously a huge concern right now, but it's also likely just one facet of larger impending issues. Today's sponsor, 80,000 Hours, has actually been writing and researching about the consequences of unregulated AI and other important issues for nearly a decade. That's because 80,000 Hours is a nonprofit that aims to help people find fulfilling careers that do good, and their research suggests that people working to help us avoid the worst risks of AI might be a really great way to make a positive difference in the world. The name 80,000 Hours comes from the number of hours in an average career. 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year for 40 years. That's a lot of time, which means a lot of opportunity for you to make a positive impact, but it can be difficult to know exactly how to do that. If you took one of those career aptitude tests in school that ask a lot of questions like, do you like working outside? How sociable are you? You may have found the results to be a little arbitrary. I know I did. 80,000 Hours have done over 10 years of research alongside academics at Oxford University into how to find fulfilling careers that harness your unique skills for good, and you can find research-based career guidance on their website. Their advice always tries to avoid platitudes and unsupported generalizations. Their recommendations are based on careful research and consultation with experts in relevant fields, and when they aren't sure of something, they say so. They offer a career guide, job board, podcast where leading minds provide insight on the world's most pressing issues, and even opportunities for one-on-one advice. All their advice and research is available for free on their site, and they don't charge for anything they provide, ever. So if you're passionate about what the evidence says about finding a high-impact career and solving problems like unregulated AI, 80,000 Hours can help. If you join the newsletter now, you'll get a free copy of their in-depth career guide sent to your inbox. Just sign up at 80,000hours.org/PricklyAlpaca. Thank you so much to 80,000 Hours for sponsoring this segment. Now let's get back to it. So starting in ascending order from least to most complicated, beginning with this little mountain study, my approach with all of these studies was basically to break down the major zones of color into really basic shapes and just lay it all out, try to get the colors and the values as close to the reference image as possible, and then get increasingly more detailed as I went along. I tend to be a very detail-oriented person with my art, so whenever I'm looking at a reference image with a lot of visual noise, it can get really overwhelming really fast, so something that I'm trying to do is really train my eye how to break things down and keep things as simple as possible early on to try to just nail the composition, nail the colors, because especially with a landscape, I find that those are the things that make a painting the most effective, that they make it feel the most real. So the style that I'm working in for these studies and a lot of my backgrounds lately is really graphic and pretty clean compared to a lot of my other painting work, and it has really been catering itself to helping me keep things simple and neat, especially in terms of layers. I do love working on one-layer paintings from time to time because it just gives you a lot of control over the blending and the overall feel of things, but for these I have really been keeping most of the elements on separate layers, especially like foreground, middle ground, and background elements. I use a ton of clipping masks whenever I'm working on these just to keep everything very divided and clean. And whenever I was working on these few studies, I also kept the selection of brushes that I was using very, very simple. This is mostly because I had not really figured out how to import Clip Studio paint brushes yet. I did figure that out later in this video, but I think fancy brushes in some ways, whenever you're learning at least, can become a little bit of a crutch, so whenever I'm doing studies like this, I do avoid using fancy brushes just so that I know I can do certain kinds of elements in a painting without those. So whenever I was working on these, I basically just used the transparent watercolor brush, which is essentially a soft round brush in Clip Studio, the chisel tip brush or calligraphy pen. This is one of my favorite brushes because it has these like angled edges to it and you can get really nice shapes whenever you use it. The airbrush, which is something people clown on but is super essential whenever you're doing any kind of painting work in digital. And like a lot of artists right now, I have been very addicted to the lasso tool and the polygonal lasso tool. I use these a lot whenever I'm laying out the basic shapes of a composition, and I also use them a ton whenever I'm laying in any kind of gradient or texture. Because I have done a decent amount of forest and landscape environment painting in the past, and I was also a Bob Ross kid, the first few studies that I did in this video went pretty smoothly, but that all changed whenever we got to the backgrounds of buildings, baby, because these are definitely my Achilles heel. So even though I dread buildings like the plague because I don't have a fantastic grasp of perspective, especially anything that goes past 1 point perspective, like I'm slowly grasping 2 and 3 point perspective and starting to understand how they're they're used in drawings and starting to like see them whenever I look at a photo, but that is very different from the experience of actually drawing in 2 and 3 point perspective, which is something that I have almost none of. Thankfully, the reference photo for this building has like almost no perspective on it whatsoever, but even though anything structural is my nemesis whenever it comes to drawing, I actually have a decent amount of experience painting cityscapes in buildings because I'm really obsessed with the art style that they use for buildings in Spiderverse and all of the concept art. I am obsessed with the art book for Spiderverse and have perused it many times, so this is something that I've studied and practiced and have been trying to get better at for a couple of years now, and no surprises, it is quite hard, but that is the general style that I'm trying to emulate here and work in. The production teams behind Spiderverse and things like Intergalactic have managed to like boil cityscapes and that kind of shape language down into such a tasty style that actually isn't too overwhelmingly complicated whenever you really break it down and try to understand it. So it's a style that I really want to get proficient in, but even though at first glance it doesn't look super complicated and it's pretty streamlined, it still takes absolutely forever to do. I believe this first building piece that I did took me a little over 4 hours, and that's actually like on the shorter end of doing a painting like this because this is basically just 2 buildings. I also, like I said, didn't really use any city painting brushes for this piece, which is something that I do later in this video because I was trying to challenge myself to make all of the little assets and resources for this piece myself. So windows, brick texture, fire escapes, everything is built from scratch in this piece, which definitely adds on to the ridiculous amount of time that pieces like this take, but it's definitely still valuable to learn how to do yourself. So finally, for this study session, speaking of things that took a little more than 4 hours and also built from the ground up, I decided why not put myself through the suffering of an entire castle piece, which castles are something that I really want to learn how to paint because I am a mostly fantasy-based artist and I really want to do, you know, story development and environment development through visual illustrations, but castles are real hard to draw. So this study was a pretty big struggle for me, and in the end I don't even like absolutely love how it turned out. Some of it is like pretty wonky, but whenever I was beginning working on it, I did try to learn how to use some of the perspective tools in Clip Studio Paint. I definitely fudged this castle into a little bit more of a 1-point perspective, even though I'm pretty sure that's not exactly correct. But I think it worked well enough for the most part, but I definitely should have probably spent a little bit more time on my little underdrawing to get all of the structures right, because spoiler alert, it didn't turn out looking as good as it could have. But despite being a castle, so a little bit of a different structure, the process of this was pretty much the exact same as the building piece that I did earlier. I worked from super simple shapes on individual layers and got more and more specific with the detail. And something like this, because it's architecture that I'm not used to at all, like I've started to learn a little bit what, for example, apartment buildings in New York City look like because I have drawn them a decent amount, but never drawn a castle before, so I really did have to go in and analyze the location of each of the windows and some of the like balconies and decorative molding, and it was just a real whole thing to try to match all of the details as much as possible and then also try to make them readable and have decently accurate values whenever I was working on them. I also at one point went in and made my own little shingle texture for all of the roofs on here, which did double as my brick texture for the prior piece. Trying to warp that and put it in perspective and give it accurate lighting was also super tricky. Unfortunately, I think this is kind of a piece where I got a little lost in the sauce with all of the details, but it was still a good experience working on it, and if anything, I want to do more castle studies now, because, you know, I gotta stick it to my past self for making the foundation of this castle so lopsided. So at this point, I finished all of the actual studies that I want to do in this video. I didn't do too many because I have done a couple more like actual landscape environment studies in the last couple of weeks. So here I was really just trying to cover my bases a little bit and experiment with a couple of different things things that I don't study most of the time. Of course, there's plenty more to do, and I fully intend to continue studying backgrounds and landscapes in the future. But right now, before actually going into the environments that are going to come from my imagination, I want to go through the pieces that I've done already and critique them a little bit and figure out the things that I want to work on and problems that I can identify to try to solve in the environment studies going forward. Here we have the landscape studies that I did in this video. I'm just going to break these down real quick all at once because they have kind of similar subject matter. Again, if I turn the saturation all the way down, we're having similar value scale issues. I'm really working significantly in the lower end of the value scale. Like everything in many of these is very dark, and some of these colors, if I sort of color pick at them, are starting to get into like the black range and the dark range, which I think for most pieces like this, unless you have deep shadow or you're just working on a darker piece in general, it's not necessary for me to make all of these values quite so dark because, again, it doesn't allow for as much readability in the pieces. Something else that I've been doing for these studies is I've been taking some liberties here and there with some of the lighting, some of the elements that are actually in the piece. I tweaked the lighting of this piece quite a bit because it was just a little bit flat for my particular style. And having fun with studies and personalizing them like that is great. I love it. It's a great way to actually motivate yourself, and in this case myself, to do studies because sometimes they do feel like work. But in some of these cases, I'll add a little critique that I think adding my own flares is maybe distracting me a little bit from seeing the actual quality of the reference image and capturing some of the colors and some of the values properly. So last up we have my little building studies that I did, which by far took me the longest out of all of the pieces that I did. I think these both each individually took around 4.5 hours or something like that because there's just so much detail that I'm trying to analyze and capture. Once again, values are just a little bit rough. I would say on, you know, the castle one, they are functioning a little bit better because that is something that I was paying attention to whenever I was working on it. I was really trying to like figure out what the general value of this would be and the value of all of the shadows in here. But you know, I do lose it a little bit in the sky here. This portion here, I think the values are all selling. I think I was able to capture the colors within like these sets of stores here pretty well. But then whenever you get to how all of the background elements here are playing with the silhouettes of these two focal buildings, the values get a little dicey and difficult to see. I was kind of trying to make it brighter and more saturated and, you know, to fit with my style, and boom, when you actually desaturate it, the values are all in a very narrow range. I definitely prefer it if I brought the values up and they looked a little bit more like this. And also just general structure, you know, straight lines, playing within perspective grids. I think these buildings look pretty good. And the structure thing that I was just mentioning, like, really shows through with, like, this whole thing, all of it. Base of this castle spatially makes no sense. I did not do a good enough job of laying out the actual buildings and where they exist on this perspective grid, so all this just looks real kind of wonky, and that's just something that I need to get used to with like really laying a good foundation in my draftsmanship. Okay, so now we're getting into the treats, into the juice of this video. This is the part that I'm excited for. This is where I get to do my own thing. I don't have to listen to a reference photo telling me what to do anymore. I can make it as fantasy nonsense as I possibly want. I have gathered a frankly ridiculous amount of painting reference. I have breakdowns. These are incredibly tasty. I can't wait to have my meal. I can't wait to enjoy my meal concept. I will have this board linked below, so if you would also like to have a nice little meal at this restaurant, you can do so as well. So I've decided the environment paintings I want to do in this video, 3 of them, so that I don't get ridiculously overwhelmed. First of all, a little treehouse concept art for my little Monster Kids story. Some of you guys might be familiar with it. Second of all, I have my cool little fantasy nonsense universe, and an island in that universe is volcanic, and it has a lot of castles on it, and I think the juxtaposition between like the lush island landscape and the volcanoes and the castles would be really fun to work with in an environment painting. And then third of all, to practice city environments a little bit more. Some of you guys might be familiar with my Spidersona. I know you guys like it whenever she pops up and stuff, so I think it would be fun to do a little like environment design background of like that AU story with a city. I have a ton of work cut out for me. I'm not confident at all that I have enough time to do all of these, so there's no time to waste. Let's get into it. So first things first, with my environment paintings, I learned from my mistakes and I started out by doing little value study layouts for all of the paintings that I wanted to do. Here I was trying to really lay out composition and lighting and trying to get something that's like not overly complicated, but also something that is interesting to look at and guides the viewer's eye to the correct place. I was also trying to stay very conscious here of atmospheric perspective and trying not to dip down into that lower value scale too much. I was really trying to use a full range instead of making everything compressed at that lower end so that I can show contrast by just how dark all of the scenes are for some reason. The first piece that I worked on was the little treehouse concept, and I basically kept the composition and the layout of the piece exactly the same as it was in the thumbnail. I literally just copied it over into my bigger file and then took each of the layers and paint bucketed in decent colors for each of them according to the values I already had laid out. I was definitely the most uneasy working on this piece because it was the first one that I did that I really had like creative freedom over, and I was really trying to pay attention to all of the roles and especially remember how much I was struggling with like the value and color side of things. That was ever present in my mind the entire time working on this, and ultimately because of that I think that I could have taken a couple more risks with this piece. I kind of played it safe, and I think as a consequence it didn't end up as interesting as it could have, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I wanted all of these pieces to be story driven because that's kind of my top priority and goal whenever it comes to getting good at background and environment art. So I linked all of these pieces to OC universes that I have that have some kind of loose narrative around them. So this one is based around my Monster Kids OCs, some of my favorite OCs because they're just so very fun. In this relatively non-existent story, the kids have access to a little treehouse that's super cool and kind of just wish fulfillment for me because my neighbors had a treehouse whenever I was growing up, but it was also rotting and the OSB floor did fall out one time and one of my friends almost fell through it. So, you know, it's sort of a pipe dream of mine to have had a treehouse that didn't try to kill me. But the overall feel of this story and universe is very Scooby-Doo adjacent. It is my theoretical 90s Cartoon Network cartoon, so it's very feel-good and nostalgic with a healthy dose of spooky. So I wanted the aesthetic of this illustration to look very storybook, very inviting, pretty graphic with a little bit of a watercolor flair to it. I think I managed to kind of do that, but like I said, I was being a little bit too rigid with this piece, and I think that I could have pushed it a little bit further. No surprises here. In particular, I'm not super happy with the color palette. I was trying to use a really wide range of greens, and I can like see something there. It's getting close to something, but I don't think I ever managed to use that range in the way that I wanted. I think with this piece I would have benefited by specifically looking up other pieces with similar color palettes to what I was going for and referencing those to get a little bit closer, because some of the colors here are just not vibing in the way that I wanted them to, and as of right now I don't quite even know what I would do to fix it. Like I said, the composition is also not something that I'm entirely happy with. Since the treehouse is the focal point of this image, I think what I would do instead is maybe show it at more of an up angle so that you can see the full silhouette of the tree and the overall focal point has more clarity to it. I think an upwards angle would also emphasize the wonder and like the emotional feeling that the children have towards this treehouse. Just sort of this larger than life element in their lives, you know, how everything feels a little more grand and special whenever you're a child. In its current state, I think this composition is a little bit dull and it doesn't do a very effective job of selling distance either. I think scale and distance overall are something that I need to work on in my environments because it is a problem that persists throughout the other pieces that I work on as well. well. In short, I think this piece turned out decent. I definitely got some good information out of practicing it, but it's definitely something that I want to like maybe retry in the future. And this is concept art after all, so I'm not even done like designing what this treehouse could potentially look like. So next we have my little volcanic island, and unlike the first painting, I kind of learned from my composition mistakes and realized that some of the initial thumbnail compositions that I came up with were good concepts and good rough ideas, but they could be strengthened by just a little bit of tweaking and reworking, especially in terms of perspective and also angle of some of the things, so I can get like more interesting lighting. So for this piece, I generally liked most of what was going on, the whole atmosphere, the low angle to show how much bigger the architecture is than the little silhouetted foreground characters, but I ultimately decided that the lighting in this thumbnail wouldn't be as fun and maybe even a little above my pay grade in terms of execution. So to make the piece a little bit more backlit and more interesting, I basically just switched which side of that bridge the characters are coming out of their boat on and made it more of a sunset vibes piece, which I think was a much better decision. While I was at it, I also made the perspective on the bridge a little bit steeper to give more of an illusion of scale and height, and I also went in and made the architecture of the island and the surrounding dock and cities a lot more specific and tried to give it more personality early on in just that silhouette phase, and that whole thing definitely helped me going forward because architecture, not my strong suit, and working with it in silhouette helps to simplify it so much more. I think changing all of these creative decisions also helps a lot with the narrative of the piece, because I've had this image in my head for a while. I'm going to be intentionally very vague because I don't know if this is actually ever going to be a story that I make, but the two characters that are sort of silhouetted in the foreground are actually escaping from the city because they're wanted and they're being hunted by the city guards. So having it be at dusk or at night where visibility is a little bit lower, having the city appear a little bit more sinister and ominous, I think all plays a little bit more into the story of the piece. In terms of process, I worked with this one very much the same way I have the whole time for the pieces in this video, but this time I did use a lot more of like my color correction tools in Clip Studio to nail down a little bit of the brightness and contrast and hue. Using color correction and color sliders is a digital tool that professionals use super often, all the time. That way you can lay a color down and then tweak it later. So I'm trying to use that a little bit more in my own work because it is huge for time saving and that sort of thing. You can especially see me use this early on whenever I'm bringing everything from grayscale into color and I'm trying to figure out what color and how saturated everything should be. Something that was really new to me whenever I was working on this piece was obviously rendering more of a distant city where I have to guess at a lot of the detail and come up with, you know, appealing looking shapes for different layers of buildings and try to insert little lights into places that would look realistic without adding too many. That was definitely something that I was struggling with because having rows of windows that are all lit makes sense in a modern cityscape, but it doesn't look right for a castle like this at all. So I had to use my little bright windows a lot more sparingly in this piece, but a huge difference in this piece that I had not been using in my prior building pieces was I did use a wonderful pack of building Clip Studio paintbrushes by Devin L. Kurtz on Gumroad, and I will have those linked in the description. This pack contains things like different window sizes, city noise and silhouettes, distant city lights, a lot of really good texture, and these were all things that helped me build up this little distant background castle a lot easier than it would be if I just had to build up all of these textures from scratch. It's always tricky to figure out a newer brush set like this, but once I kind of started getting the hang of it, it was a ton of fun to use. And again, they were super time saving, and since I was going for more of a concept art aesthetic for this piece, they really helped me to get that extra little bit of detail and texture in there that I historically have had a lot of trouble getting with just my regular little paintbrushes. For those who are unaware, concept artists photo bash and use scanned textures and specialty brushes all the time. All of that texture and detail is not achieved by just tediously painting by hand. That's not cost effective. So working with these kinds of time-saving brushes and tools for a change was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it because normally I paint in all this stuff myself. So in the end, this piece is definitely not perfect. There's a couple of things that I would handle a little bit differently in terms of some of the perspective and the stylization, but overall I'm pretty happy with this piece. I think this is the first piece in this video that I would be like, yeah, I think I did okay on that one. Okay, up last but not least, I really saved the candy for the end of this video because I probably spent maybe 7 or 8 hours on this piece, and by the end you will see why. So this, like I said, is my Spider-Sona based piece, so I am very much just using this as an excuse to once again practice the Spiderverse cityscape art style. So once again, like the previous piece, right off the bat I kind of decided that the concept that I had laid out in my previous thumbnail was not nearly strong enough. I think that it was okay, but I didn't have many buildings to play around and render with. The dynamics were just a little bit too simplistic for my taste, and I wanted to tackle something a little bit more complicated. So I kind of took that same concept of my little character sitting on top of a billboard watching the little digital newscasting on the sign and expanded it out to include a lot more of the overall city and show a lot more detail. And this was to basically force myself to experiment and work in perspective a little bit more and with a lot more buildings that I normally deal with. So at first with this piece I was kind of winging it a little bit. I was experimenting a lot with the distant city brushes that were included with that brush pack to kind of establish the skyline and kind of the ambiance disappearing into the background. But eventually I did kind of start adding in some of those closer focal point buildings, and instead of laying it out with line perspective, I kind of did this by making volumes with color, basically establishing a really rough light source in my head, building out one volume to be kind of my reference volume for the direction of the overall perspective, and then I just duplicated that same rectangular cube shape and then warped it into perspective with a bunch of different varying heights and widths and angles and that sort of thing. And this actually proved to be a pretty nice way to lay out a little cityscape. I kind of treated it like working with actual three-dimensional objects in Blender, but I didn't feel like working in Blender for this video, so I just did it the hard way. That is also something that people totally do, by the way. They'll build out an entire cityscape in Blender and then just port a screenshot into an art software and paint over it. Perfectly valid way to do that as well. Like I've been doing throughout the video, I just kept all of those basic shapes on different locked layers, and then I was able to go in with little color sliders and tweak the overall color of the building, the saturation, the hue, and this helped me to really effortlessly come up with a varied color palette that all looked good together, and I could just easily tweak it by using the hue sliders. I can't recommend doing that enough. It's really a lifesaver for a bigger piece like this. And like I've been doing for all of the processes in this video, I basically just went in and slowly added more and more and more detail. A big focus in a piece like this is making all of the buildings visually distinct and different and make sense together. Like for example, a lot of the shorter buildings in an environment like this are going to be more apartment buildings or residential, and then bigger ones, of course, will be skyscrapers, office buildings, convention centers. So those are going to have different qualities from one another. They're going to have different windows, different architectural features. So that is something that I definitely looked up reference for in this image. Something else that I tried to do was lead the viewer's eye a little bit with the composition of this piece, because that is something that I lack whenever I'm laying out composition. So I added in a little subway train that goes right through the center of the piece and guides my character's eye directly to the little futuristic billboard screen that's floating through the sky. And I really like how that turned out compositionally. I think that it works really well for this piece. Again, as I go deeper into this piece, no surprises here, the building brush set that I got off Gumroad was so helpful for saving me a ton of time with this, because I had so many different options for little windows. I had lots of options for distant building shapes and texture and bricks, and there's even a fence brush, a fire escape brush in this pack. I didn't have to paint fire escapes from scratch this time, which made me so happy. So a lot of working on a piece like this is just pure tedium, like going in and, you know, choosing a set of windows and shaping them into perspective on top of the building using a clipping mask. I use the free transform tool in Clip Studio Paint to do this most of the time and kind of just eyeball the perspective according to the shape of the building. And the name of the game with a style like this is all the little tricks that add depth and detail without being too labor intensive. So for example, whenever you have a block of windows, I would usually make them a dark color at first to kind of be a shadow like the window frame, and then I would just duplicate the layer, add a light color to the top layer to be the lights inside the windows, and then offset that light layer with a clipping mask so that I have a little bit of a depth there to the windows. Painting in blinds and curtains and blacked out windows in the closer buildings is also a great trick for adding detail. Again, on closer elements, fences and fire escapes and that sort of thing add a ton of realism. And then going in and adding a brick texture to the closer buildings or some kind of texture really helped stylize the piece in a really pleasing way. And then finally, adding really effective lighting was a huge deal here, because adding big areas of light bleed and atmospheric perspective really helped sell the illusion of depth and push some of those bigger buildings into the background. This also helped balance some of the values of the piece and make sure nothing was too dark or too overwhelming. And I think this also helped the piece from a story perspective, because again, I was trying to make these story driven in some aspect, and whenever it comes to Spiderverse, each AU spider has like kind of their own look to their city in the art style going into it. So I know I said I was going to try not to use eye bleed colors in my art, but I kind of betrayed that with all of these pieces. Listen, it's a character flaw that I'll live with, but I definitely see this being kind of the general visual style of this Spider's universe, what it would look like. So on that note, of course, to finish up this piece and tie it together, I had to draw in my little character kind of lurking over the city and watching over it. So I did that with super simple color blocks. I mostly silhouetted the character and kind of roughed in the design. And then finally, to add a little bit more atmosphere and drama to the piece, and especially make the lighting really pop, I thought this would be cool if it were a rain scene. So I kind of painted in a bunch of rough little rain strokes and used the motion blur on them to make them all dramatic and add motion to them. And then by the end of the piece, I finally had my dessert. I did a ton of tweaking with blend mode areas to make different areas of lighting pop and just add more atmosphere and bring some of the glow from the windows back in. This piece is definitely not perfect. I already see a ton of areas that I can improve on, especially like scale and perspective, but I had so much fun working on it, and overall I'm pretty happy with how it came out. So finally, if you're someone who struggles with backgrounds like I historically have, I'm going to have some resources linked in the description to help you out. I feel like half the battle is just finding the right people to teach you the right skills for what you're interested in. So if you want to paint the kind of concept art fantasy nonsense that I'm interested in painting, how to paint simple environments with Mark Burnett, painting backgrounds for TV animation from BAM Animation, and top 10 tips for environment art with Tyler Edlin are all great videos that I think you should check out that I referenced whenever I was working on this video. Also, if you want to get super specific with the Spiderverse cityscape style, I would recommend How to Paint Building Spiderverse Style by Daniel Ang Art. The Clip Studio paint brushes that I used in this video are also linked below. I downloaded them from Devin L. Kurtz on Gumroad, and they're available for free or with the donation of your choosing, and they are incredibly helpful. I absolutely love them, so I do recommend throwing a few bucks Devin's way if you're able to. Devin even has some free sets of background art available to download if you want to practice value and color without worrying too much about laying out a scene yourself. So I highly recommend all of these resources if you are intimidated by backgrounds but you've been wanting to give them a shot yourself. And I have never gone to art school or taken any formal art classes, so everything I've learned is from other artists on the internet. Everything that you need to know is probably available for free online or for a very fair price in a workshop. You just gotta hunt it down and find it. So what did I learn from this video? Well, ultimately, if anything, I think I learned that I need to be painting backgrounds more. If I did half as many backgrounds as I've done character art in my entire life, I would be significantly better at drawing them. So I should really just bite the bullet and get over the art fear and actually start just doing the thing. And I've definitely walked away from this video with several key struggles to work on. Structure and value, still big things that I want to improve on. But more importantly, I think I've discovered several things in terms of backgrounds that I really enjoy painting that are going to motivate me to actually work on this. I did not expect cityscapes of all things to be something that I really enjoy painting, but I just love the process of it. I find it to be weirdly relaxing, and maybe that makes me a masochist. I don't know, but I'm certainly not gonna stop painting little Spiderverse style backgrounds. I think there's also a version of my future self that will eventually enjoy castles as well, hopefully. Anyways, all that being said, I hope that you enjoyed watching the video and watching me paint all of the art that is currently flashing across your screen. I know that this was more of a process-focused, more like an experimental video, and it won't be for all of my audience who just enjoys listening to me talk about lore, but this is the background work to making good pieces that produce lore, so it's something that I do want to take more time to work on this year, because hey, it'd be cool to do design videos that include environments too. I've had some requests for it, and I thought, hey, that sounds like a good time if I were good at painting environments, so I'm gonna try to get good at painting environments. Anyways, like I said, thank you so much for watching. I know this video was very disjointed and a little experimental in many ways, but I appreciate you being here for it. But as always, most of all, I appreciate my beautiful, gorgeous patrons, and especially my executive producers. You guys are the most helpful clip studio paintbrushes that I have in my arsenal, and that is the highest compliment. As always, a huge thank you goes to Infinity131, Faith, Mossy Raven, subscribe to Prickly Alpaca, wow, thanks for the shout out. I'm not saying that name on the internet, ABW Makes, Sarah, Crimson Moon 04, Awendu, Liana, Ermler Jean, Anubix, Breeza, Sony, Brian, Phoenix, Rose Draconi, Ira, Freedom and Gus Gus, Kat, Dodo, Zyle S, Agent.Sketchy, Thea Maya, Lovisa, Eloquent Silence, Megan Penland, Enozine, India Gloom, Hypnos, Katie, Sweet Winter Garden, Gravity Drop, I Hang Out with Cats at Parties, and Bean the Bread.